Well, don't know if there will be more people coming, but it is 2:30. So good afternoon, everyone. So glad to see you all. I would like to welcome you to our annual event of the academic lecture, which will be delivered this year by Mr. Laurent Toriens, who you can see his picture up there. You have probably been able to read up on him in the enclosed file sent to you with the original invitation. But before I forget, sort of technical thing, I would like you to leave your microphones muted during the lecture. And if you have any questions, please ask them afterwards. I expect for those of you who know through their craft and study of the long-standing relationship between Scotland and the Low Countries, for many of you, this is probably a sort of surprising view at a part of your own history, which you have never heard or thought about. And if you want to know more about it, actually, I suggest via the internet, take a look at the site of the University of St. Andrews, where they actually made a study of Scotland and the Flemings and et cetera, and you can read up on things like this. I won't bore you with my words, of course, even if the subject of Low Countries, of course, is very close to my heart. I gladly yield to our expert on the subject, Dr. Laurent Toriens.
Thank you very much, Ronald, for this introduction, and thank you all for the invitation. I was very pleased to be invited to give this lecture. This is a subject I've been interested in for a long time. My interest really is a bit wider. I'm a medievalist and a linguist myself. I studied medieval history and comparative linguistics. And in the combination, I became a Celticist. And being Dutch, I became interested in the historical links between Celtic-speaking countries, Celtic-speaking parts on the British Isles, and the Netherlands and Belgium. So I'm interested in connections with Wales as well, and I published about them, and I also published about connections with Scotland. So that's a bit about my background. I'll try to start a PowerPoint now. Yes.
Sure.
I'm not going to show you where Scotland is, as I think that's very obvious for all of you, but I have a picture, a satellite picture of what we might call the Low Countries, as that is perhaps a bit of a difficult or strange concept. Not as strange as you might think. Low Countries and Netherlands literally mean the same thing. And they are the low-lying countries near the sea, where a number of large rivers, the Rhine, the Meuse, the Scheldt, enter the sea. A large part of these low countries, the Netherlands and Belgium, in political terms nowadays, are actually below sea level at present. That was not the case during the Middle Ages, at least the High Middle Ages. And the coastline was quite different from what you see on this picture here. But this is about the area which we consider the Low Countries. And in when historians talk about the Low Countries, it means more or less the present-day Netherlands and Belgium together. So that's why we differentiate between the Netherlands as the political Dutch kingdom and the Low Countries as the larger geographical area. For the Middle Ages, it's important to know or to realize that this part of the world was not a political unity. There were a lot of counties and duchies which sprung up since about the year 1000. They became more or less independent. And sometimes they worked together, sometimes they worked against one another, and only slowly during the period of the Middle Ages until about 1500 in the 16th century, they were united under the Burgundians, later the Habsburgs, and then the whole fell into pieces again during the war against Spain of the northern Netherlands. We'll come to that. It's important for you to have an idea about what these parts are on the map. And a very important area is in the southwest Vlaanderen on the map, Flanders, because that was in the high Middle Ages and later Middle Ages, the economic hub, a very densely populated and highly urbanized area, which was politically important, and where trade with the outer world, also with Scotland, was centered. Bordering Flanders, you see Brabant, which was from about 1200 also a very important political entity in Western Europe. The Dukes of Brabant were powerful dukes who had relationships with English kings, with France, with Burgundy, etc. And they played a significant role on the political table in Europe at the time in the later Middle Ages. And it were Flanders and Brabant, which during the medieval period were the political and economical center of the Netherlands. After the Middle Ages, the balance shifted to the north, and Holland and Zeeland became more important. And that's why it is useful to speak about Low Countries when we speak about contacts with Scotland in this case, because in the earlier period, the contacts were mainly with the south, with Flanders, and in part with Brabant. And in the later period, early modern period, contacts were mainly with the north, with Holland. These contacts have really always existed. The North Sea always was a high road for contacts in trade, etc. With England, with Scotland as well. There's evidence, archaeological evidence from early medieval contexts. There are early medieval objects in Scotland, which definitely come from the Low Countries. That's a period I'm not very much at home in, so I leave that out of this paper, this lecture. And we start with William the Conqueror. And you might ask, what has William the Conqueror to do with Scotland? But he does. And at first he has to do with Flanders. His wife was Flemish. She was the daughter of the Count of Flanders, so he had very close relations with the County of Flanders. And as we know from historical sources and from the Bayeux tapestry you see on the picture here, he also had connections with Brittany, of course, bordering Normandy. He fought battles in Brittany, but he also found allies there. And when William the Conqueror invaded England, he did that not just with an army of Normans. About nearly 1/3 of his army were Flemings. And another 1/3, small 1/3 perhaps, were Breton knights. And they all together with the Normans invaded England. And all these fighting men were more or less paid by offering them land and estates in England by William the Conqueror. That's important. That brought a large wave of Flemings into England, who gained sometimes very important, powerful positions in England. So that's how a lot of Flemish people came into England. A problem is that we don't know exactly who these Flemings were. They must have been mostly younger sons of the lower nobility, of knights. Knights were not really part of nobility at that period. So you could say adventurers, mercenaries. We don't know in detail where they came from, from what families they came, but they became important men in England. Well, let's return to this map briefly. I told you about the various counties and duchies within the Low Countries. You can see here in the South Flanders and in the center South Brabant, the two important areas during the Middle Ages, and after the Middle Ages, the balance of power shifted to Holland and Zeeland in the north. All these duchies and counties were fairly independent of each other. They were sometimes cooperating, sometimes not. Sometimes they were in a unity. Holland, Zeeland, and Henegouwen, below Flanders, you see, were shared one count during quite a long period, for instance. So that's the areas. Then we were looking at William the Conqueror. I told you about the Bretons and the Flemings taking part in his army in the conquest of England. I don't think I have to repeat what I told you about this. The picture shows you what's happening here. What you see here is William the Conqueror attacking a castle in Brittany. And on this map, you have to look careful, but there are a lot of tiny dots on the map, and all these dots were estates held by Flemings in England in 1086. So they were all over England, not in the far north, not in Wales, of course, but in the central England and in northern England. Everywhere you could find English estates held by Flemings. In the more or less the same period, David, we all know as David I of Scotland, became into possession of the honor of Huntingdon in England, now part of Cambridgeshire, where there were a lot of estates held by Flemings. So he came in direct contact with these Flemish settlers in England. Also at the same time, Henry II, who became king in 1154, I think, became quite annoyed with all these Flemings because they became more and more powerful. They held more and more estates, got richer, and he didn't like that. He wanted, of course, to have the Anglo-Normans the prerogative and the power, and not see it slip to another nation or a different kind of people, of however you would like to call them. So in 1155, he expelled all Flemings from England. What we see then is that probably some of these Flemings went back to Flanders, or at least to the continent, but others traveled into Wales, where the Welsh marches and there were still independent Welsh kingdoms, offered room for them to settle and to expand their power. But they were also in part welcomed in Scotland, and certainly so by David I when he became King of Scotland. What's important there is that he had to establish his power in Scotland as king. It's nice to become king, but then you have to ascertain you have a kingdom as well. And he had to ascertain his power, and he used all kinds of, for that time, new methods for that. We speak about the feudalizing of Scotland, which was more or less done by David I. There's some debate about the terminology. But one of the things he did was founding a lot of royal burghs, so new towns and royal castles, and he needed people to live there, to populate these new towns, to be trading and working there. And he knew that Flemings, with their background in Flanders, they frequently still had contacts in Flanders, which was densely populated and highly urbanized, were the people with the right experience to do such things. So you see here where these royal burghs and castles were founded, and from historical sources we know that in almost all these places we also find people who can be identified as Flemings. The identification is sometimes difficult. Sometimes they are actually called Fleming or de Flandria, or from Flanders, in the historical sources, in charters, for instance. Sometimes you have one of them is explicitly called a Fleming and another is a brother of him, so you may assume the brother was Flemish as well. Sometimes we are not really sure, but the name seems to betray a Flemish or at least a Germanic continental background. So fixing the Flemish in these places is sometimes difficult. So identifying people as Flemish is sometimes difficult, but on the whole, we can see that quite a lot of Flemings came into Scotland, settled in these places, became involved in town life, in trade, in industries, and helped in a way, well, willingly, consciously or not, King David in settling his power in this part of Scotland. A very good example of this, where we are quite sure we are dealing with Flemings, is the Upper Clydesdale. I published an article about the Flemings who came into Scotland in the 12th century, and the Upper Clydesdale was one of the best examples there I could find. In the place called Bergen, there was a settler who was a leading figure in a group of settlers whom we know in the sources as Baldwin of Bergen, and already his name, it's a very tiny detail, but he's not called Baldwin, but Baldwin, and this inserted vowel in his name makes certain that he is from the Netherlands. You can compare the former Belgian king, Boudewijn, where this vowel is inserted as well. We do this standard in Dutch in such combinations of sounds. And we have a lot of Baldwins in England and in Scotland as well in the same period, where we don't see this inserted vowel, where we cannot be sure he was Flemish, he may have been Norse or English or whatever. But in this case, the man is called a Fleming, his name betrays he is a Fleming, and he was important in this area. And we know there were quite a lot of people around him, also in towns around Bergen, who were identified in the sources as Flemish as well. For any one of you ever being in the area, Bergen is worth visiting. There's a very nice museum where they have a reconstruction of what Bergen looked like in this period, with a moat castle, medieval houses, and they have some representations of historical figures, and Baldwin of Bergen is there as well, dressed as a medieval nobleman. So very interesting. People in the Upper Clydesdale still remember that they have this Flemish connection in the area. There are quite a lot of moat castles in this area. A moat is an artificial hill with a tower or a small castle on top, and a forecastle around it with adjacent buildings for practical purposes, which is defensive and overseeing the area. These people coming into these areas were settlers in the first place, probably frequently farmers and traders. If you think of the film Braveheart, you see in the beginning of this film, you see these English incomers in south of Scotland in a castle like this, in a moat castle. They are pictured very negative. They are, of course, in the film, they have to be English as the enemy. I don't think the situation was always that negative, but there were new people coming in, bringing in new kinds of economic structures, and in that way taking over all kinds of power structures, economic structures in the area. And that was, of course, very useful for David I and the kings following him. Malcolm was important in this, to affirm their grip on these parts of Scotland. Another very well-known Fleming coming in much further north in Scotland was Freskin, who was given land near Elgin and in Duffus, but also in Fife and further south in Scotland. He is perhaps the original builder of the beginning of Duffus Castle. You see a picture of what that might have looked like here. And there's some debate whether this first castle was built by Freskin himself or by his son, but we are still in the 12th century. There's also in the literature no doubt that Freskin was of Flemish descent, which is perhaps a bit odd because his name could be translated as Little Frisian. But then, on the other hand, we know that in the High Middle Ages, in this period, the whole coast of the Netherlands from the far north, where it borders to Germany, to well into Flanders, was known as Frisia. So he may have come anywhere from these coastal areas in the Low Countries. Freskin had a lot of descendants of noble families in Scotland. For instance, also the Douglases claim descent from Freskin. This is a big problem in Scottish history because we know a lot of these noble families through history, through the Middle Ages. The clans, of course, are an example as well. We really never know how these families started, and we don't know what the original first power brokers in these families were. So a lot of noble families in Scotland claim to be of Flemish descent, but it can virtually never been proven that this is correct. The most obvious telling name is, of course, Fleming, which is a very frequently occurring family name in Scotland, where it's difficult to doubt that they don't have Flemish ancestors. But for the other families, it's often, well, virtually impossible. A historian in the 17th century said we know these families in the stream, but we don't know them in the fountain. We never know the actual beginning of these noble families when they started to gain power over larger areas and the people around them. I showed you a map of the Low Countries during the Middle Ages. This is a map of Scotland in the Middle Ages in the time of David I. And you see this is almost as much a patchwork as the Low Countries were at the same time. I've written pinkish, but on my screen now it's a bit light yellowish. That was the royal domain where David could really yield his power. So you can see it in Strathclyde, for instance, but also in the north in Murray, where he settled Freskin. The yellow parts were parts where he had his vassals, which he could control, but these men were fairly independent. Still, they could do their own thing if they didn't like what David wanted. And the brown colored areas were only nominally under the power of the Scottish king. There were clans there who were still leading the traditional Gaelic clan life and noticed probably nothing or virtually nothing of the power of the king, King David, or his later followers. They would probably come to court when there was something to celebrate, for instance, but they were certainly not willing to do anything the king asked of them. And you can see the Isles, who are still white on this map, were still under Norse rule, and when, well, virtually not part of Scotland at all at this time. This only changed in 1263, the Battle of Largs, when the Normans were defeated and the kings of Scotland could start claiming their power in the Isles as well. But at the same time, the clans came up. There, of course, is the beginning of Clan Donald, who these big clans were quite independent of the kings of Scotland, settled in Edinburgh, Holyrood, Fife, etc. So that was for quite a long time not a secure unity in Scotland. And only when under severe stress, and that means under severe threat by the English kings, all these Scottish groups came together to fight the English. Another map here of medieval Flanders in some more details than we have seen it now. As I said, Flanders was highly urbanized, and on this map you see a number of the more important cities. There were even more smaller cities. Flanders in the 13th and 14th century and northern Italy were the most highly urbanized areas in Europe. Cities were about 25 kilometers apart. So you could travel from one city to another in a day. These cities had an important industry. Frequently, cloth industry was important. And not only there was a Count of Flanders, but the city had quite a high measure of independence as well. The map you see is, again, a modern map of the area. During the High Middle Ages, the coastal strip of Flanders existed of mud flats, where during this period people started to build dikes and reclaim land from the sea and make it arable. What this meant is that on the mud flats they could raise sheep and grow wool for their textile industry in the cities. But when these mud flats disappeared because they were turned into polders, the sheep disappeared as well. So the Flemings had to start to import wool more and more on a larger scale. And there were three parts of Europe where this wool came from. One was Spain, very important high quality wool. Another was England, and another one, and certainly not unimportant, was Scotland. So trade with Scotland became of very great importance for the Flemish cities, for the industry. And very soon Bruges, I underlined it on this map, became the most important center for this trade. It was given the staple for the Scottish trade with the Low Countries. So everything coming from Scotland into the Low Countries had to come through Bruges. There was a conservator there, a kind of ambassador who had overlooked this trade, who set rules for it, who could organize things for the traders when things went wrong. As a kind of ambassador, he could act for them. And he was appointed by the Scottish king. I marked two other places on the map. Ghent, you see there, that was the other one of the very big cities in Flanders during the Middle Ages, in the northern part of Flanders, certainly, Ghent and Bruges. And we absolutely know for sure, because it's reflected in their names, that there were people from Ghent in Scotland. And for the people, I sometimes call them a settlement, a small Flemish colony in the Upper Clydesdale. For a number of the people there, named in charters and other historical sources, they carry names reflecting the area where they came from. They all came from the uttermost south of the county of Flanders, so south of Lille, where I drew a large circle on the map. And as I said, we can only pinpoint the places where they got their names from on the map. We don't know what exactly position of their families was in this area, but they must have been younger sons from knights, lesser nobility, etc., that kind of people who traveled through England and to Scotland. And I don't know of any evidence for the Scottish situation in this period, but from the Welsh situation in the 12th century, we know for sure that the people who settled in the southwest of Wales, coming from Flanders, did not lose contact with home. They had contact with Flanders even when they were far away on the other side of, not only of the North Sea, but on the very other side of the British Isles, of Great Britain. Bruges, as I said, for a long time, the staple, the most important harbor. You can see on this map that it is fairly inland now. It had an open route to the sea running to the north, but this silted up during the Middle Ages, and that meant that the Scottish staple had to be moved. Ships could no longer reach Bruges directly from the sea. A canal was dug, but that didn't work. The canal still exists. And the staple had to move to keep this trade with Scotland going. It moved to Middelburg in Zeeland at first. I have a map of that a bit later. It moved to Zeeland, and Antwerp, which is a city in the Duchy of Brabant, gave it a try, wasn't successful. Other different cities, various cities, tried to get this staple, this right to have the trade with Scotland. Well, what was so important in this trade for the Flemings? It was definitely wool, which was the most important item to import. Wool, fleeces, also hides, leather was important. And in this wool trade, the Scottish monasteries were very important. Monasteries like, for instance, Melrose on this picture had large herds of sheep. They produced a lot of wool, and they thrived through this trade and became rich by the wool trade. Other important export products for Scotland, as I said, leather, also coal, some iron ore, so the heavy bulk materials. In the other direction, of course, trade goes in two directions. Scotland imported mostly luxury items. For instance, illuminated manuscripts, which illumination had reached a very high standard in Flanders in this period. And these luxury manuscripts were very much liked by Scottish nobility and people in monasteries, bishops, etc. So we know they ordered and bought manuscripts. Not only the books across the North Sea, one of the most well-known and famous miniaturists was a small family of painters, manuscript painters, the Bening family, originally from Ghent, but they moved to Bruges. Father and son, Alexander and Simon Bening, were the most important painters in this respect, and you see some examples of what they produced on the picture here. And Simon had a daughter, Cornelia, who married to Andrew Halliburton, and Andrew Halliburton was at that time the conservator of the Scottish staple in the Netherlands, so he had a direct contact to this Scottish trade. And Halliburton is interesting and important for us as historians because one of his lectures survived. It's a lecture of about 4 or 5 years of trade in the first decade of the 16th century. It's been published in around 1860 or 1870 in Scotland. And that's a very important source for us to know what this trade really meant, what went in the different directions, who were buyers and sellers. So that's a very important source. One of the most exciting items of this trade or transport from the Low Countries to Scotland are, of course, the Trinity Altarpiece by Hugo van der Goes in the National Museum, National Gallery in Edinburgh now. Hugo van der Goes was still is a very well-known panel painter for altarpieces, portraits from this period. And it's rather certain, some people doubt it, but most art historians believe that the portraits of King James and Margaret of Denmark are actual portraits. Perhaps someone made drawings of portraits in Scotland, sent these drawings to Flanders where the altarpiece was produced, and then the altarpiece was shipped to Scotland. And I don't know if all of you ever saw them in real life. They are really very big paintings. They are almost, well, not life sizes, perhaps overstated, but it's a huge altarpiece. It was ordered by Bonkill, who was an important church figure, and he is also depicted on one of the other panels. Of course, what you see here is one side, and there were other sides to it, where he is praying in front of Christ. He's praying for Christ, as is more or less usual on these paintings, and the king and queen are accompanied by their patron saints. More items traveled. A number of church bells in Scotland are known to be made in Flanders. Not only church bells were produced, it's the same process of making. Guns were made as well and exported. There was an influence on polyphonic music which thrived in Flanders during the later Middle Ages. We have the Scottish composer Carver, who made very beautiful polyphonic music in this period, which very clearly shows the influence of what happened in Flanders and northwestern France at the time. There were influences on architecture as well, in church building, for instance, but also the use of brick roof tiling, simply because bricks and roof tiles could be used as ballast for ships when sailing from Flanders to Scotland. And well, when the bricks and roof tiles ended up in Scotland anyway, why not use them? This again happened in two directions. Ships from Scotland used large pebbles, stones, as ballast. When these were unloaded in Flanders and later on in Zeeland, they were used to cobble roads, and some of these roads still exist, and geologists are able to trace exactly where these stones come from along the Scottish coast. So sometimes it's the area around Bergen, which was an important harbour. Sometimes it's further north. Leith was, of course, an important harbour. And well, I wouldn't be able to tell the difference, but geologists are very sure that these cobbles are not from anywhere on the continent, but definitely from these coastal areas in Scotland. So we can still walk in the traces of the Scottish trade. Well, I mentioned Berwick as an important harbour, definitely in the earlier period of trade, the 12th, 13th century. There's a story about Flemings who had a large hall in Berwick where they could store their materials and where they could stay for themselves. And during one of the English attacks on Berwick, this hall with all the Flemings in it was burnt, tells the source. So it wasn't always going well. Later, Leith and also Dundee became important ports in Scotland. In the Low Countries, as I said, this started in Bruges, later Middelburg, then Veere. And Veere was the staple port, at least formally, until well into the 18th, early 19th century. That was normally only at that time, but they still had a formal title of the staple for the Scottish trade in the Netherlands. As I said, Antwerp was in the race. Cities, the aldermen of the cities received envoys from Scotland, gave them wine, etc. Tried to gain this right of the staple, wasn't always successful. And it has become clear that Bergen op Zoom, another Brabant city, played a central role in this. This wasn't known for a long time. I once did research into the history of relations, international relations of the town of Bergen op Zoom, and I came across this Scottish settlement there. There was a small group of houses just outside the city walls, which were owned by Scottish traders. They had a hall, like the hall in Berwick there, where they could, well, it was literally an inn where they could keep their materials, but also receive traders who were staying just for a shorter period. They were selling and buying houses constantly, probably because they couldn't carry around lots of money all the time. There were no banks at the time, so you had to invest your money. And one man lived in, not outside, but really in the town of Bergen op Zoom. He really was a member of the community. His name was John Moffat. He was born in northern France, but he was definitely of Scottish descent. And at a certain time, after Halliburton had died, and there was a period in between with another conservator, but then John Moffat was made conservator of the staple of Scotland in the Low Countries. So he was very much involved in the negotiations with Middelburg and Veere. He had a house in Veere as well, but he remained on the main living in Bergen op Zoom, and from there he organized he really organized this trade. And until recently, we didn't really realize what the role of the town of Bergen op Zoom in all this was. I wrote an article about this, which will appear later this year. To give you an idea of where these places are, Bruges is at the very lowest end of the map. It's just there. I can't see it on my screen because there's a B underneath. That's where Bruges is. The M is for Middelburg on the island of Walcheren. Now this map looks quite different because the islands are connected and the coastline is quite different. V is Veere, north of Middelburg on the same island. There are still Scottish houses there. You can see them in a small town museum with not much information about the Scottish trade, but still they are known as the Scottish houses. You see BOZ for Bergen op Zoom, which again is in Brabant. The river entering the estuary there is the Scheldt. And deeper south along the Scheldt, of course, is Antwerp. So these cities were clustered in a not very large area, and they were all competing to gain this monopoly on the trade with Scotland. Then there were dynastic ties as well, and especially with the Counts of Flanders. And in 1286, when Alexander III of Scotland had died, Count Florence V of Holland claimed the Scottish throne. He based his claim on his great-grandmother, Ada, a daughter of Henry of Scotland, and again a granddaughter of David I. This claim led to nothing. Florence had hoped that the King of England would support him, but of course, we wouldn't be surprised the King of England didn't. He claimed the throne himself. So this led to nothing, but there were political diplomatic contacts, and Florence even traveled to Scotland to lay this claim. There were other diplomatic contacts and diplomatic gifts. Of course, I guess every tourist knows Mons Meg in Edinburgh, the big cannon. It was a gift from Philip the Good, the Duke of Burgundy, to King James II. And Philip the Good was also the one who organized the wedding between James II and Mary of Gelre, Egmond Gelre. She was a great niece of Philip the Good, and Philip paid for the wedding and for her dowry. So he really organized this wedding and pushed it through, which of course led to a very close relation between both the Burgundian, kingdom is not the right term, but territory, and Scotland, and also Gelre and Scotland. And Gelre is in the east of the Netherlands, to the northeast of Brabant and parts of modern-day Germany. This again brought trade. Not only Mons Meg, but cannon were delivered, both bought and as gifts, to Scotland. Mons Meg was made in Enno, Henegouwen, where there was a big industry in heavy iron and bronze materials. So cannon making was important there. These weapons were well known at the time, had a very good reputation, and were very much liked in Scotland as well. Not always with great success, because one of the kings lost his life when one of the cannon exploded when he wanted to fire it. Then, as I said in the beginning, the situation changed after the Middle Ages, the early modern period, when the Reformation came along. The Reformation in the Low Countries really started in the deep south, in Flanders, but we were at that time under Habsburg and Spanish rule, very Catholic, and the Reformed people, the Protestants, were very much forced to flee the south to the north. They went to Holland. That meant that the cities in Holland, which were then fairly unimportant, not very big cities, exploded. They had large groups of refugees, well, almost like we see now with Ukraine. Cities like Haarlem, Leiden saw their population not just double, but grow manifold in a very short period. And these Flemings and people from Brabant, these Protestants, were for a large part, again, people active in textile making. They were weavers, textile traders. So they brought their trade with them, which led to an economic growth in the north and an economic drain in the south. Another result was that the Dutch provinces revolted against the Spanish king ultimately, because they wanted religious freedom. In fact, they really wanted, the nobles ruling these provinces wanted freedom for themselves. Well, perhaps more important, to tax for themselves, but also to decide for themselves which religion to allow or not. But religion was definitely not the most important thing on their mind, but it came handy to unify people behind the cause. This resulted in an 80 years war, which was very devastating, definitely for the south of the Netherlands. The northern Netherlands came out with a golden age, and then you think of the period in which Rembrandt and other painters became great, and people in the cities in the north became very rich. And this led to a division. The south, what more or less now present-day Belgium, remained Catholic and under Spanish and later Habsburg Austrian rule. The north became Protestant and became a republic, which was very revolutionary at the time. A country without a king, quite unthinkable. And this meant also that the contacts overseas changed. Catholics from the British Isles, recusant Catholics from England, Wales, less so from Scotland, kept coming to the southern Netherlands, to present-day Belgium. There were colleges there where priests could study. Louvain University was, of course, a bulwark of Catholicism. And Protestants from the British Isles, and definitely also from Scotland, came to the northern Netherlands, where they fitted in with the Protestants there. And they were, in many cases, also willing to fight for the Protestant cause during this 8 years war. Well, you can see this on this sheet. For the Jacobites in Scotland, France was more important politically than the Low Countries, the Netherlands, where Holland, we could say now the Dutch Republic, because of course the political weight of France was much larger in Europe than the political weight of this odd republic, where the rest of Europe was looking at, not really knowing what to expect from it. And then later during this period, of course, the marriage between William of Orange and Mary Stuart, well, a Stuart, Scottish princess, but that didn't do Scotland very much good. I suppose you know about the part played by William of Orange in, for instance, Glencoe. He wasn't there himself. He wasn't wielding the sword, but in a certain respect, he was definitely responsible. And this led to a period in Scotland where Highland culture was definitely repressed and more or less destroyed, where the Netherlands, the Republic, plays a role, again, as we will see in a moment. Protestants joined this war already in 1572, when the war had really just begun in the Netherlands. Volunteers came over from England at first, and I say England, but a lot of them were Welsh. And in 1585, Elizabeth I sent the first Count of Leicester to the Dutch Republic, to the Northern Netherlands. Republic, as I said, was a difficult concept, was a bit strange. And the Dutch at first had asked Elizabeth I if they wasn't interested in being the Queen of the Northern Netherlands as well. Clever as she was, she denied. She saw the problems with France and with Spain coming, but she saw no problem in volunteers from her kingdom going over to fight. And after more begging, she sent Leicester more or less in her place, which wasn't very successful. Leicester wasn't a great man on the battlefield, so he wasn't all that successful, but it affirmed the ties between the various counties again. A lot of Scottish volunteers came over as well, sometimes just soldiers who came for pay and for no other cause, some who really came for the Protestant cause. And this resulted in Scottish regiments fighting on the Protestant side from 1787 until 1678, sorry, till 1782. There constantly was the Scottish Brigade in the Republic, in the Dutch army. This brigade had 6 regiments in it. 3 of them were called English regiments, 3 of them were called Scottish regiments. From a certain moment, they all became Scottish, and they always recruited in Scotland, mainly again in the Highlands, clansmen who came over to the Netherlands to fight. And in the later period of the Republic, when this 18 Years' War was long over, these regiments were frequently posted in what is now Flanders, where the northern Netherlands still had a number of fortresses to guard the Netherlands to the French. So we had outposts more or less to keep the French away, and these outposts were manned by Scottish garrisons. There were Scottish garrisons all over the Netherlands as well. And there's a lot of genealogical information about these men, because they of course were wedding, they had children, etc. They were sometimes buried in the Netherlands. A lot of records. Also tangible remains. A very impressive one I found is this one, the remains of colors of a Stewart Company in the regiment of Edmund. This war flag was lost during the Battle of Newport in 1600, and then during the same battle regained. Well, not undamaged, as you see here. Stewart Company was one of 12 companies in this regiment. And the Battle of Newport is very important in our 80 Years' War. Every child in the Netherlands, every Netherlander, we know our own history very badly. But when you say 1600, people say Newport, or when you say Newport, people say 1600. Frequently, they don't know where Newport is. It's along the Flemish coast. There's another Newport in the Netherlands, but that's not where the battle took place. But an important moment in Dutch history, and a Scottish part in it, in the battle. In Scotland, there are memories of this Scottish Brigade as well. For instance, the Buccleuch Regiment has a reenactment group at present. I found nice pictures of them on the internet. And also quite important and quite unknown in the Netherlands is this wall painting in an outbuilding of Loevestein Castle. Loevestein Castle is a medieval castle quite central in the Netherlands, so in the river area. It's where 2 rivers meet, strategically an important place. There was a Scottish garrison there for quite a long time. and there is a small museum commemorating the Scottish presence there. But unfortunately, the room where this wall painting is not always open in this museum. You specifically have to ask to find someone with a key. You can see this wall painting. It's not absolutely certain whether this is Murray and his family, but it's nice to think it is. What's more important is that we see Scotsmen doing in the Netherlands what was forbidden in Scotland. And they were wearing Highland dress, they are dancing to pipe music. At this period in Scotland, this was strictly forbidden. And in the Low Countries, these regiments could keep these traditions going. And I think it's unfortunate that in Slot Loevestein, no more attention is paid to this, well, this relic, this item, and this link with Scotland. Lord George Murray, who perhaps on the wall painting, he was exiled after 45. He was a staunch follower and fellow fighter of Bonnie Prince Charlie. He had to leave Scotland, came to the continent, traveled around France first, but then he ended his life in Medemblik in the far north of North Holland, where he still lies buried. And his grave is still there as a commemoration of him. The pictures you see are made when his 250th anniversary of his death was commemorated. The white cockade you see placed there. I visited the grave about 10 years ago and there were still fresh flowers on the grave. So he's definitely not forgotten. And well, we might think it's telltale that he decided to end his life in the Netherlands, where the Scottish Brigade was active, where he found fellow Scotsmen whom he could link up with. Because we had this long period of Scottish regiments in the Dutch army, at first they were formerly British regiments loaned to the Republic. In 1782, they were nationalized by the Dutch government, which meant that a lot of the soldiers and officers left the Netherlands, but quite a lot of them stayed as well, because they had been in the Netherlands for so long. Especially the officers, they stayed for generations, and the posts went from father to son, or at least were kept within the family. And soldiers were almost always recruited in Scotland, and well, mainly in the Highlands. They were from Glen Sutherland. I don't really know about Glendonald. Mackay is important. And the result is that we have a lot of Dutch families with Scottish names, sometimes very recognizable, sometimes less recognizable because they were given over time a more Dutch sounding, easier to pronounce form. But we have families Mackay, Stewart, Sutherland, McGillivray, Ferguson, Graham, MacLeod, etc., etc. The same goes to a lesser extent for Welsh names as well. We have Morgans, we have Floyds, which are frequently now called Fluit because we can't pronounce, of course, the slur in Dutch. And especially from these families, the Mackays became important in the Netherlands. They have for several generations been important politicians. And one of them has been a prime minister of the Netherlands for a time, and he also fulfilled other political functions, but also later in time, relatives of him fulfilled political roles in the Netherlands, being members of parliament, etc. So Mackay is a name which sounds very easily in the Netherlands. We always have an association of some kind with a politician with this name. On a more peaceful level, students from Scotland came to the Dutch universities in the time of the Dutch Republic. Especially the universities of Leiden and Utrecht were very popular, and they came to study theology. Of course, they were Protestant, and they could study both Lutheran and Calvinist Protestantism at the universities in the Netherlands, which they couldn't do in Oxford or Cambridge. They came to study law because Dutch law, like Scottish law, is based on Roman law, unlike English law. So again, not attractive to go to Oxford or Cambridge and attractive to come to the Low Countries. And they studied medicine as well. And a very nice reminder of this is a very large Bible manuscript, which was kept in the Mariakerk, the Church of St. Mary in Utrecht, for a long period. The church doesn't exist anymore. The manuscript is in the University Library in Utrecht now. It's a Bible in 6 volumes. Each volume weighs about 20 kilograms. And people visiting the Mariakerk, the Church of St. Mary in Utrecht, had a habit of adding their name in the margins of the Bible manuscript. You see a small example of this on the picture. And quite a large number of the people who inscribed there were from Scotland. Either their names tell this, a Stewart is obvious, a Scotsman, or they added the place where they came from. And they were not always students, they kind of been just tourists or other people just visiting Utrecht. And as I wrote, an analysis is still due. The manuscript is completely digitalized, so if you feel you have some time to spend, you can go to the site of the University Library of Utrecht and see the manuscript. But there are not names on every page, so you really have to search for them. But there are really a lot, not just dozens, but I think hundreds of names in it. And it would be nice to filter out the Scotsman, the Welshman, the Englishman, etc. Try to find out where all these people came from. I come to an end now. I think I've been speaking for quite a long time. I've been keeping you busy. If you are interested, there are 2 books in general on the subject, Scotland and the Low Countries, appeared in 1996. It contains the papers of a conference in Aberdeen. My article about the Flemings in the 12th century is in it. I think the book is a collector's item now, but I suppose you can find it in libraries. The other book is more recent and focuses on Flanders. So the present-day Netherlands, the northern part, is not really reflected in that book. It is the result of a research program and a conference in St. Andrews a couple of years ago. This is a book, it's published by Bergen Press. It's written for a wider public, so it's easily accessible. The Congress papers, unfortunately, are not going to appear because lack of funding. A number of the articles have already been published. A number of other articles will be published soon, amongst them the paper I mentioned. I wrote about the Scottish presence in Bergen op Zoom. In both books, you find references to further literatures, things to read. There's extensive literature about the Scottish Brigade, if you are interested in the genealogical information. Unfortunately, the Caledonian Society in the Netherlands doesn't function anymore. They were great for the genealogical research, but there's information available and there's still a lot of work to be done. I thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed and were interested. Thank you. There's a possibility if there are any questions, well, before that, I thank you for the help with the PowerPoint presentation. I've learned something new that was very useful as well.